Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're tackling a figure who, well, he generates a lot of discussion, to say the least. Sayyid Qutb. We've got excerpts from Sayyid Qutb and the origins of radical Islamism to dig into.
Okay.
So let's explore how his life, what happened in his life that led him to become this pivotal voice in Islamic thought.
Yeah, it's interesting. The book takes, I think, kind of a different approach than some.
Okay.
It doesn't, ask us to condone Qutb's more, let's say, radical ideas.
Right.
But it does encourage us to approach his life story with empathy as a way to, I don't know, I guess, understand the man behind the ideology, you know?
So less about agreeing with his conclusions, more about tracing the path he walked.
Exactly.
What were the influences, the things he went through
Yeah.
that ultimately led him to embrace such a radical interpretation of Islam?
Yeah, and the author argues that Qutb's Islamism was very much a product of, his time and his own, personal experiences. So to understand his trajectory, I think we really need to start back with his roots.
Okay, so let's go back to the beginning. The book takes us to Musha. This is Qutb's village.
Right.
And it feels like, I don't know about you, but reading it, it feels like a world away from the political landscape that he's now associated with.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to remember that Qutb began his life in a rural village where tradition was, it was just deeply ingrained in everything. Picture like adobe homes, the focus on agriculture, a pace of life very different from the intellectual circles he's moving in later.
Yeah, and the book mentions, I thought this was interesting, it says, even the poorest families in Musha, they enjoyed a weekly meat meal, which kind of surprised me.
Yeah.
That speaks to a certain level of communal well-being, at least in that one small way. But it wasn't all idyllic, right?
You're right. The book definitely doesn't romanticize village life.
Right.
It still highlights the social divisions that existed even within this small, tight-knit community.
Right.
While many were relatively comfortable, others lived on the margins. And this is where I think it gets kind of interesting. The book talks about the presence of jinn and afarit in the village folklore.
These are supernatural beings, right?
Right.
I remember reading that Qutb later, rejected those beliefs as superstition as he got older.
He did. As he kind of, embraced a more modern, I guess, rational worldview, he moved away from that. But I think these early encounters with that kind of supernatural element, I don't know, I feel like they reflect a kind of spiritual undercurrent that persisted in his thinking. Even though he rejected it, it's almost like these childhood beliefs, they were dismissed by his logical mind, but they kind of continued to influence his worldview on a deeper level.
It makes you wonder.
Yeah.
What seemingly insignificant things from our own childhoods might be shaping our present in ways we don't even realize,
Absolutely, yeah.
But eventually, Qutb leaves Musha, right? He goes to Cairo. And that must have been a huge shift.
Oh, yeah. Imagine the contrast. You go from this traditional village to, Cairo in the 1930s, it was like this bustling, modernizing city, this clash of old and new, wealth and poverty. It was all there.
And this is where I think the book really digs into the social dynamics of the time. Because it wasn't just about city versus village.
Yeah.
It was also about this specific class that Qutb belonged to.
Yeah.
The Effendia, basically the educated middle class.
Exactly. And they were caught in this difficult position. On the one hand, you have modernization, creating all these new opportunities.
Right.
But it was also eroding traditional hierarchies and leaving the Effendia, kind of struggling to find their place in this rapidly changing society.
So Qutb arrives in this environment already carrying his own baggage, so to speak, from Musha.
Right.
And now he's witnessing the social upheaval firsthand. Is that where his nationalism, starts to solidify?
Absolutely. The book really connects his kind of growing resentment towards British colonialism and this perceived, erosion of traditional Egyptian values directly to his experiences in Cairo. He saw this elite class, which he was now a part of, grappling with all this rapid change and Western influence, and it really started to shape his worldview.
It really does sound like Cairo was this, crucible for his developing worldview.
Yeah, definitely.
This is also where he begins his formal education, right?
Right.
You sent over that passage about his time at Dar al-Uloom.
Yeah.
What was significant about that specific institution?
So Dar al-Uloom, it was It was more than just a religious school, right? I
Yeah.
mean, it was definitely steeped in Islamic tradition.
Right.
But it also exposed Qutb to secular subjects too, history, literature, even economics. Wow.
So really, it was kind of preparing this new generation of Egyptian thinkers and leaders, to navigate this rapidly changing world.
And it was during this time that he really dives headfirst into literature.
Yeah.
The book highlights his early career as a writer, his admiration for figures like Abbas Mahmud al-Aqad.
Yeah, al-Aqad. I mean, he was like this towering figure in Egypt's literary scene, like an essayist, a poet, a critic. Like, he really influenced Qutb's intellectual development. And you got to remember, this is a time when a lot of Egyptian intellectuals, they saw literature as this tool, for shaping national identity.
Yeah.
They really believed that by reviving their cultural heritage, they could achieve true independence.
So for Qutb, writing wasn't just an artistic pursuit. It was intertwined with with his burgeoning, nationalist sentiments. Exactly. He saw art as a weapon, right, in the fight against colonialism and Western influence. And I mean, you can see that reflected in some of those excerpts you shared from his early literary criticism.
Yeah.
He really championed writers who celebrated Egyptian culture and was very critical of those who he felt were, mimicking Western styles.
It's just amazing how all these personal experiences are fueling his intellectual and ideological, growth.
Yeah.
But then the book takes this turn, right?
Yeah.
As we enter the 1940s,
Right.
the sense of disillusionment, it creeps into his writing.
Yeah.
What happened during this period that caused this shift?
Well, I mean, the 1940s in Egypt, I mean, it was a turbulent time, political instability, the ongoing struggle against British control.
Right.
And then kind of the perceived failures of secular nationalism, all this left a lot of people, including Qutb, they were searching for new answers.
Right.
And I think this is a really crucial point in his journey because it really lays the groundwork for his later embrace of this, more radical Islamism.
And it's during this period that he travels to the United States.
Right.
That feels significant.
It is.
Like a turning point.
Oh, yeah, it's a critical turning point. But maybe not in the way that a lot of people would assume. You know what I mean?
Right, right.
You would think experiencing American modernity firsthand
Yeah.
would have moderated his views, right?
Right.
But it kind of had the opposite effect.
You shared some striking passages about his time in the U.S., like his description of Times Square.
Oh.
It was both exhilarating and chaotic, the way he describes it.
Yeah, initially he was struck by, America's energy, its dynamism.
Right.
But that initial fascination, it soured, I mean, pretty quickly. He became deeply disillusioned by what he saw as this rampant materialism, individualism, and a lack of spirituality.
Even with all the churches.
Yeah, he was actually, and that's a good point, he was particularly critical of the separation between religion and public life, which, obviously contrasted sharply with his own worldview.
You highlighted a passage where Qutb, he's surprised, right, by the amount of churches he finds in Greeley, Colorado.
Right.
And it seemed paradoxical to him. He's like, here's this place that, at least in his mind, it represents nature in a simpler way of life.
Right.
But yet they have all these houses of worship.
Right, right.
And yet he still feels like it's so spiritually bankrupt.
Exactly. And I think that anecdote really encapsulates his growing disillusionment. He came, I think, expecting to find some connection to spirituality in America, but instead all he saw was a culture obsessed with material wealth and superficiality.
And this is so far a cry from the spirituality he kind of at least glimpsed in his childhood, right?
Yeah.
Even if he'd intellectually moved on from those beliefs.
Yeah, and it's his time in America, rather than, opening him up to Western ideals, it just solidified his belief that, Islam offered a superior social and moral framework. And I think, this experience was essential in pushing him towards this more radical interpretation of his faith. He returned to Egypt even more convinced that Western values were incompatible with Islam, and that a return to Islamic principles was the only path to true liberation.
And this is where he becomes increasingly involved with the Muslim Brotherhood, right?
Yeah.
Was it immediate, this transition into a more, radical expression of Islam?
Yeah.
Or was it more gradual?
I mean, it's important to understand that Qutb's involvement with the Muslim Brotherhood, it wasn't a complete break from his past, He'd been sympathetic to their ideas even before his trip to America. But I think his experiences there, his growing disillusionment with, both Western and secular nationalist models, it kind of propelled him towards this more radical interpretation of Islam, one that, resonated with the Brotherhood's ideology.
So his time in America wasn't the sole cause, but it acted as a catalyst, like pushing him further down a path he was already on.
Exactly. It really solidified his belief that, a return to true Islamic principles was the only answer to, like, all these challenges facing Egypt and, the Muslim world. But it's also important to remember that, like, even within the Muslim Brotherhood,
Right.
Qutb's views were considered extreme by some.
Oh, wow.
He wasn't afraid to challenge, existing interpretations of Islam, even among those who shared his fundamental beliefs.
So even within this movement, there were nuances, disagreements, complexities.
Absolutely. And I think understanding those complexities is, like, essential if we really want to, grasp the evolution of Qutb's thought and his eventual impact, on radical Islamist movements.
Let's delve into that further then. The book mentions a specific term that becomes central to Qutb's philosophy, and that's jahiliyya.
Yeah.
This seems like a good place to maybe, unpack the more radical aspects of his ideology.
It is. It's crucial. It's a crucial concept to understand because it really forms, like, the bedrock of his later writings,
Okay.
And it's resonated with radical groups, ever since. Essentially, jahiliyya, it refers to a state of ignorance or barbarism. It's this, like, pre-Islamic period.
Okay.
Characterized by, like, this lack of moral guidance and a rejection of God's law.
So it has historical roots.
Right.
But Qutb's using it in a broader sense.
You got it. Yeah. That's a crucial point. Qutb didn't see jahiliyya as just, like, some, historical period. For him, it was this pervasive condition. It was afflicting any society, even Muslim societies, that, he felt deviated from true Islamic principles.
Okay.
He argued that many modern societies, with their focus on materialism, individualism, separation of religion and state, all of that, in his view, was essentially a state of jahiliyya.
So in his view, it was a regression.
Yeah.
To a more primitive state.
Yeah.
Even if those societies considered themselves advanced.
Exactly.
It's a stark and very absolute, framework.
Yeah.
But how did he reconcile this idea of, like, this world, steeped in jahiliyya with the reality that, he couldn't possibly overthrow all these systems, single-handedly?
Right. And that's where his concept of revolution comes into play. And it's both personal and societal. And I think to fully grasp that, we need to look at, the period after his return to Egypt, his increasing involvement with the Muslim Brotherhood, and then his eventual imprisonment under Nasser's regime.
So we've got this concept of jahiliyya, this, like, pervasive state of ignorance. And Qutb becomes increasingly convinced that radical change is needed. And then, boom, he's in Nasser's crosshairs.
Yeah.
What impact did his imprisonment have on the development of his ideology?
Oh, it was huge. His imprisonment was absolutely a turning point. You have to remember, like, the context in Egypt at the time, right? Nasser's government, they were cracking down on the Muslim Brotherhood. They saw them as a threat.
Right.
And so Qutb is arrested, tortured, and spends years in prison. And this experience, it just, it deepens his resentment of what he sees as, like, secular tyranny,
Right.
And it just further radicalizes his thinking.
It's one thing to, like, theorize about a society, steeped in jahiliyya.
Right.
But to then experience what he perceived as injustice at the hands of a secular regime, it just seems like that would solidify his worldview in a very powerful way.
Totally, totally. And this is where his writing takes an even more, I guess, radical turn, He writes his most influential work, Milestones, while he's in prison. And in this book, he's basically arguing that, look, true Islam, it just can't coexist with these systems that he considers to be in this state of jahiliyya.
Right.
He's calling for, like, this vanguard of true believers to, to rise up, to establish God's rule, to create this new social order. He even suggests that, in some cases, violence might be necessary to achieve those aims.
So this is where his ideas move from, like, critiquing society to, like, actively advocating for its overthrow.
In a sense, yeah. It's essential to understand that, he wasn't calling for, like, a reformation of existing systems,
Okay.
He believed they needed to be, like, completely dismantled and rebuilt, according to his, very specific interpretation of Islamic law.
Right.
He didn't see any room, any possibility for compromise with, like, the secular world. And it's this, like, uncompromising stance, that would really resonate with later generations of radicals.
It's a chilling realization, especially knowing that Qutb was executed in 1966. I mean, his ideas didn't die with him. If anything, his death seems to have made them even more, I don't know, potent.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Qutb's execution by the Nasser regime, it just served to, I don't know, like martyr him in the eyes of many.
Right.
And his writings, especially Milestones, they gained a wider audience. They were circulating underground, and they started influencing this new generation of, Islamist thinkers and activists who really saw him as this, I don't know, like a visionary, this man who had spoken truth to power and paid the ultimate price.
And his ideas continued to resonate even more broadly after the Arab-Israeli War in 1967, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the 67 war, it was a watershed moment. The defeat of the Arab forces, I mean, it was seen by many as this humiliating blow, to secular Arab nationalism.
Right.
And it just fueled this, like, sense of despair, disillusionment with Western ideologies. And then you have Qutb's writings, right, with their emphasis on Islam as the solution, you know what I mean, to these problems facing the Muslim world. They just provided this powerful alternative for those, who were searching for answers and a path, to resistance.
So in a way, Qutb's legacy it's one of unintended consequences.
Yeah, yeah.
He becomes this symbol of defiance, even if, the methods used by some of his, self-proclaimed followers, they went far beyond what he might have condoned.
Yes, totally. And I think that's really the heart of the matter, right? Qutb's writings, they are complex, they're open to interpretation. And while he explicitly advocated for, the overthrow of these systems that he considered jahili, I mean, his views on, like, the use of violence, they are debated.
Okay.
Some scholars say that, he only supported violence as, like, a last resort,
Right.
while others point to passages in his work that, they seem to justify these, more extreme measures. So I think it's just important to remember his ideas have been appropriated and I think sometimes distorted by groups seeking to, to justify their own agendas.
It's a cautionary tale about the power of ideas, especially those that, speak to people who are, feeling alienated or disenfranchised.
Definitely. It reminds us that ideas, even if they're rooted in a desire for, justice, for a return to traditional values, they can be used to justify, violence and extremism if they fall into the wrong hands or are interpreted without, proper context.
Right.
It really underscores the need for, like, critical engagement, with his work, with understanding his historical context, all of it.
Well, this deep dive has given us a lot to consider.
It has.
We've gone from, like, the dusty streets of Musha to the heart of Qutb's, radical ideology.
Yeah.
We encountered this man who was shaped by his experiences and driven by this, like, yearning for a different world. It's been a journey, like, through history, philosophy, and the very nature of belief itself.
Yeah, and it highlights the importance of understanding figures like Qutb, not to, like you said, condone their actions or beliefs, but to really, grapple with the complexities of our world, and this enduring power of ideas.
Absolutely. And as we confront these ongoing challenges of extremism, the role of religion in society, Qutb's story serves as this stark reminder that the past is never truly past. It's echoes. They just continue to kind of reverberate in the present.
Well said, well said. Understanding those echoes, grappling with their complexities, that's, I think, that's the first step in, like, navigating the challenges that, of our own time.
Indeed. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We'll be back next time with another exploration of a topic shaping our world. Until then, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep seeking those, deeper understandings.